On a cold December evening in 2002, the quiet community of Modesto, California was about to be shaken to its core by a tragedy that would capture the nation's attention. This is the true story of Laci Peterson, a young woman whose life was brutally cut short, and of the subsequent investigation and legal proceedings that ensued. The narrative that follows is based on verified details, official dates, and accounts from law enforcement records, court documents, and contemporary news reports. It is an investigative and factual recounting of one of the most publicized murder cases in the United States. Laci Denise Peterson was born in May 1975, and by all accounts, she was a kind-hearted and vivacious individual who had dreams for the future. Married to Scott Peterson in 1997, Laci was expecting her first child, a baby boy, with hopes of starting a new chapter in their shared life. The couple lived in Modesto, a city known for its friendly neighborhoods and uncomplicated rhythms of daily life. As the holiday season approached in 2002, there was an added sense of excitement and anticipation among those who knew them. Yet as Christmas Eve unfolded on December 24, 2002, that hopeful excitement turned into confusion and ultimately despair. On that fateful evening, Laci was last seen at her home in Modesto. Family members later recalled that Laci had mentioned plans to possibly visit friends the following day, but nothing more was known of her whereabouts after that time. When Laci did not return calls or respond to messages the next morning, worry began to spread among family and friends. What was initially thought to be a delay or a minor misunderstanding quickly escalated into a full-blown search as concerns deepened. By December 25, 2002, the initial reports of Laci's disappearance reached local law enforcement in Modesto. Officers began by canvassing the neighborhood and interviewing family members, friends, and acquaintances. The investigation was fraught with difficulties from the outset. With little evidence and few witnesses, the police sought to reconstruct Laci's last known movements, scrutinizing phone records, her daily routines, and any possible threats that might have loomed over her tranquil life. Investigators soon discovered that Laci's disappearance took place amidst a backdrop of personal conflict and stress. However, no overt signs of foul play were evident from her personal relationships, and so detectives were forced to widen their net. During the early phase of the investigation, the absence of Laci was handled as a missing person case, a decision that many in the community found both perplexing and heartbreaking. As days passed with no sign of Laci, the pressure on law enforcement to make swift progress grew exponentially. The breakthrough in the case came in April 2003. On April 18, 2003, a routine tidal exploration along the shore of San Francisco Bay, an area not far from Modesto, yielded a discovery that would alter the course of the investigation. Amidst tangled seaweed and driftwood, remains were found and soon identified as belonging to Laci Peterson and her unborn son, later to be known as Connor Peterson. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community and intensified media scrutiny. Forensic teams were deployed immediately. Medical examiners performed autopsies to determine the cause of death and gather evidence that could shed light on how and when this tragedy had occurred. The forensic evidence, while painstakingly assembled, suggested a planned and calculated act of violence. The nature of the injuries, along with the condition in which the bodies were found, indicated that this was not a simple case of an accidental death or natural causes. The close cooperation between local law enforcement agencies, including the Modesto Police Department and the California Department of Justice, ensured that every detail was meticulously documented. Investigators began to focus on the individuals in Laci's immediate circle, and suspicion naturally fell on her husband, Scott Peterson, especially given the rapid pace at which he appeared to move through his own narrative following her disappearance. In the weeks following the discovery of Laci and Connor's remains, investigators turned their full attention to Scott Peterson. Interviews, background checks, and re-examinations of his statements highlighted inconsistencies that fueled suspicions. Law enforcement officials noted that Scott's behavior in the days after Laci's disappearance did not align with that of a grieving husband. Instead, many of his actions appeared calculated, a stark contrast to public expectations regarding how one should behave in the wake of such a personal tragedy. Multiple sources, including confidential informants and evidence gathered from telephone records, began to paint a picture of Scott Peterson's movements that raised red flags. His alibi for the night of Laci's disappearance was scrutinized, and investigators discovered discrepancies that could not be readily explained. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement officials began to piece together a timeline of Scott's activities that began to contradict his earlier statements to police. One of the pivotal moments in the investigation was the revelation that Scott had made several public statements that appeared to minimize the gravity of the situation. Instead of expressing immediate shock or deep sorrow, he was seen engaging in activities that many construed as unusual for someone in the midst of personal disaster. The emerging picture suggested that Scott might have been concealing a deeper involvement in the disappearance of his wife. With mounting evidence and an increasingly compelling narrative, law enforcement arrested Scott Peterson in December 2002, not long after Laci's disappearance and amidst growing public outcry. The arrest marked a dramatic turning point in what had been a perplexing missing person case and signaled a shift towards confronting a suspected murderer. Following the arrest, Scott Peterson's interrogations became a central focus of the investigation. Detectives noted that his responses were often vague, and when pressed for details, his answers frequently changed. These inconsistencies were later used by prosecutors to argue that Scott was involved in a deliberate attempt to mislead the investigation. Detectives collected physical evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, and painstakingly built a case that would eventually be presented in court. As the investigation entered a critical phase, the case migrated from local law enforcement hands to the broader judicial system. By early 2003, detectives had filed charges, and the groundwork was laid for what would become one of the most highly publicized murder trials in recent American history. The complexity of the case, combined with its tragic nature, ensured that every move by the prosecution and defense would be scrutinized under the public microscope. The trial of Scott Peterson began in earnest in November 2004 at the Santa Clara County Superior Court, located in San Jose, California. In the courtroom, emotions ran high as the prosecution presented evidence that had been gradually assembled over months of intensive investigation. The trial's proceedings were methodical, as the defense and prosecution battled over the details of the timeline, the interpretation of forensic evidence, and the credibility of witness testimonies. The prosecution argued that Scott Peterson had meticulously planned the disappearance and subsequent murder of Laci Peterson. Central to their case were the discrepancies in Scott's statements, the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene, and the timeline of his whereabouts on December 24, 2002. Testimonies from law enforcement officers, forensic experts, and even acquaintances of the Petersons were presented to establish a narrative of deceit and calculated wrongdoing. One of the key pieces of evidence that the prosecution highlighted was the manner and location in which Laci and her unborn son's remains were found. The forensic details suggested that the bodies had been exposed to the brutal effects of the natural environment for an extended period, inconsistent with Scott's version of events. The prosecution's forensic experts testified in detail about the decomposition, the positioning of the remains, and even the likely movements of the bodies in the coastal waters, all of which painted a grim picture of premeditated murder. On the other side, the defense team maintained that despite the damning circumstantial evidence, no direct link could conclusively prove that Scott had committed the murders. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that the police had, in their haste to solve the case, allowed biases to color their interpretation of Scott's actions following Laci's disappearance. The defense called into question the reliability of witness testimonies and argued that the forensic evidence could be interpreted in multiple ways. Throughout the trial, the courtroom became a stage upon which the tragic narrative of the Peterson family was dissected in minute detail. Every statement, every piece of evidence, and even every gesture from those involved was parsed for meaning. Within the jury box, a group of 12 ordinary citizens was tasked with sifting through the overwhelming complexities presented before them. Their responsibility was enormous: to deliver a verdict that would either confirm the suspicions borne by months of investigation or exonerate a man who maintained his innocence. After weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and extensive deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict on November 11, 2004. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Laci and of second-degree murder in the death of her unborn child, Connor. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and sorrow both locally and nationally. For many, it represented an attempt at justice for a young woman whose life had been stolen by betrayal and premeditation. The legal proceedings did not end with the verdict. In March 2005, following further legal review and sentencing hearings, Scott Peterson was sentenced to death. The sentencing process, as recorded in court documents, was as emotionally charged as the trial itself, with testimonies from family members of Laci and Connor underscoring the irreparable loss that had befallen them. The aftermath of the trial saw Modesto and the broader community grappling with the ramifications of the case. For many years, the case remained a painful reminder of how appearances can be deceiving and how tragedy can lurk behind closed doors. The media continued to revisit the case regularly, and subsequent appeals by Laci Peterson only prolonged the legal saga. However, through every twist and turn in the legal battles that followed, the primary narrative remained clear. A young woman had been brutally murdered, and a man had been held accountable by a system that sought to restore some semblance of justice. More than a decade after the events of 2002, the Laci Peterson case still resonates in the halls of legal and criminal investigation studies. It is frequently cited as a landmark case in discussions about media influence, forensic science, and the complexities of handling cases that involve both a missing person investigation and a subsequent murder trial. Scholars and investigators alike have analyzed the investigation's timeline, the role of circumstantial evidence, and the intricate dance between public sentiment and judicial impartiality. For many in the legal community, the case represents a cautionary tale of the challenges inherent in balancing the protection of individual rights with the pressing need for justice in the face of overwhelming public emotion. Critics have debated whether the speed with which law enforcement zeroed in on Laci Peterson was influenced by a desire to find a culprit quickly, thus risking the possibility of overlooking alternative explanations. Nonetheless, the amount of physical and testimonial evidence brought forward during the trial provided a strong basis for the conviction, solidifying the case in American legal history. Over the years, supporters of both the prosecution's approach and the defense's cautions have contributed to a broader understanding of how complex, emotionally charged cases should be handled. Law enforcement agencies across the country have since revisited and updated their protocols for missing persons investigations, ensuring that while swift action is necessary, every detail is given due consideration and weighed carefully against the principle of presumed innocence. The Laci Peterson case remains a sobering reminder that behind every headline is a human story, a mix of hope, despair, and the relentless pursuit of truth. The investigative team, from the first officers who canvassed the quiet streets of Modesto to the forensic experts who painstakingly analyzed evidence on a suburban lab bench, worked under the pressing demands of a tragic timeline. Their methods, while subject to later scrutiny and debate, ultimately exemplified a commitment to uncovering the truth, irrespective of how painful that truth might be. In the courtroom, the intricate details of the case were laid bare. The emotional testimonies of family members, the methodical explanations of forensic experts, and the strategic maneuvers of legal counsels all contributed to creating a cumulative narrative that left little room for doubt. For every investigator, every lawyer, and every juror involved, the responsibility was immense. There was no simple way to rectify the loss of a life, especially one as cherished and promising as Laci's. Some have argued that the case also highlights the delicate balance that must be maintained between media coverage and the sanctity of the judicial process. In an era when every detail of high-profile cases is broadcast rapidly and widely, the Laci Peterson trial demonstrated both the potential benefits and pitfalls of such exposure. While extensive media attention helped ensure a degree of transparency and public oversight, it also risked compromising the presumption of innocence or swaying public opinion before a verdict could be reached. Ultimately, however, it was the meticulous work of investigators, the sober determination of forensic scientists, and the structured, rule-bound operation of the legal system that drove the case towards its conclusion. The legacy of these efforts continues to influence modern practices in criminal justice and remains instructive for law enforcement agencies and legal professionals alike. Beneath the legal jargon, the forensic details, and the news headlines lies the enduring human cost of the Laci Peterson case. For those who knew Laci, a devoted wife, a caring friend, and a soon-to-be mother, the tragedy is remembered not as a series of legal maneuvers, but as a profound personal loss. The silence left by her absence is felt deeply in the hearts of her family and friends, whose lives have been irrevocably changed. The trial, with its long days in court and its unending cascade of evidence, often served as a painful reminder of the fragility of life and the ease with which it can be violently taken away. For the community of Modesto, the case was a stark call to reckon with the realities that can hide behind familiar faces and within seemingly ordinary homes. It was a lesson in both the relentless nature of law enforcement and the sometimes insufficient measures taken to protect the most vulnerable individuals. As time has passed, many have looked back on the investigation with mixed emotions. Gratitude for the eventual delivery of justice, intertwined with sorrow for a potential future that was never realized. The narrative of Laci Peterson, meticulously documented and heavily scrutinized in the aftermath of her death, serves as a perennial reminder of the need for vigilance and the importance of ensuring that no potential clue goes unexamined in the pursuit of truth. For those interested in the precise chronology of events, the following timeline encapsulates the key moments of this tragic case. December 24, 2002. Laci Peterson is last seen at her home in Modesto, California. Family members note that she had mentioned plans for the following day, but she never returns.